What up, y'all? I'm your girl, Dr. CBS, here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown.
You're tuned into season 2, episode 5 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
Ow. All right, y'all, before we get into our very interesting and controversial topic for Shoot the Shit, we want to give a shout out to our patrons. So thank you to Darren, Mac, and Tony for becoming patrons. We appreciate it. Hope that y'all continue to support the channel so that we can pay your boy.
For the Shoot the Shit section today is in a mixture of in these tweets in a way.
Yeah, it is.
But so, you know, we all be on Twitter. Some of us tweet more than others. Some of us have a bigger platform than others, as we talked about last week. But anyway, so, you know, we're not going to highlight we ain't on here. So there was a tweet that went out that seemed to spark a bit of a timeline outrage, at least on my timeline. Y'all can speak for your own. So, you know, Queer Socialism, who's one of the co-hosts of a Comrade podcast, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, put out this tweet. I will read it for y'all. I used to be very resistant to the naming of the specific violence experienced by black men as gendered/sexist violence because it goes against everything the orthodox field of feminist gender studies trained me to believe, but I was absolutely wrong. And then he later goes on to say, I have spent much time the last 2 years studying slavery plus incarceration, understanding that black manhood and masculinity constitutes that of a subjugated manhood and masculinity, which contradicts the core ideological tenets of colonial patriarchal masculinity, positioning the masses of black folks on its political outskirts. And now I cannot understand how we can understand black male social existence as anything other than racialized, gendered oppression. So there are other tweets, but I'll get y'all initial reaction to that, and then we can just kind of move through some of what the streets were saying.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, my initial reaction is, yeah, right. It just, you know, I don't know if it's because I'm trained in Black studies or because like I've been on Tommy Curry's work for years now. Some people just get known, but it seems like completely obvious that the state targets Black men because they are Black and because they're men. I wouldn't go so far as to say this is sexist violence. I do think it's very much gendered. And the problem is that because of, you know, I would say women's and gender studies and feminist studies, we often conflate gender and women. And so I think this is one of the sort of confusions that we get into, but I think that Black men are absolutely targeted because they're men and because of the colonial situation in which we find ourselves, speaking specifically about the context of the United States, but also just as a result of global colonialism and imperialism. And so this just seems to me to be like, yeah, like what's so controversial about this? But of course, the controversy comes from epistemology and ideology as opposed to like material fact.
I mean, and I think the same, and maybe also because of a background in Black studies, but also, I mean, I've gone through orthodox feminist training as well. And this has never been, even my understanding or my relationship to feminism has never been one that excludes the way Black men experience gender violence. That's never been outside of the purview for me. And I think even in terms of some of the ways that like Kathy Cohen tries to help us situate queerness in relationship to sort of normative kind of structures of whiteness, we understand that Blackness, whether that be Black femaleness or Black maleness, exists in a certain way in relationship to the state, to the sort of colonial project. And so again, I think the same kind of initial reaction as you, CBS, like it's not really news to me, but I am sort of interested in what it is about this moment and this particular dialogue that got people so riled up.
Yeah, so let's go to that. So this tweet here is reflective of the general response that that people showed on Twitter. So there was a lot of quote tweets, but the general sense of people who did agree with this is that Black men don't experience anything other than racism. So anything such as lynching, where your genitals were cut off, or or the disproportionate amounts of black men in prison. These things can all be explained solely through racism. There is no CBS said gendered aspect to it, or a sexist aspect. I know we're not conflating those. I'm saying they're saying there's neither. So that's been the general response. I think for me, I mean, I've been on different sides of this. Like, I think there's a thing where when you come into these kind of social justice circles, particularly as a straight black male, you're kind of taught to hate yourself in a way. I don't know the other way of putting it. Like, you walk in and you're told that you're the problem, and some of us really be trying to do right, so we assume that that's true. So we try to rehabilitate ourselves, and we try to check our privilege and all of these kind of like liberal terms, and then you come around and realize like it's just not that simple, and you can't just morally rehabilitate black men as this kind of isolated group, as if we're the only people that do harm or perpetuate harm. So yeah.
Well, and I think that, first of all, what the fuck is plain old racism? I think that that's just an ignorant thing to say, because racism, if we really understand racism and anti-Black racism in particular, gender, sexuality, nationality, and all of these different forms of domination make plain old racism very sort of complicated and a complex phenomenon. So I don't even know what that means off top. And secondly, I think that, as you were saying, to Black, there's a way that feminist discourse can really try to have propriety over like intersectionality, or propriety over a way of understanding gender, as if acknowledging that Black men experience gendered and racialized and sexualized violence somehow undermines the experience of Black women, or of Black women and femmes, or non-men, basically. And I think that that's just absurd. And somebody who's really interesting to think with here is Jen Nash, where she talks about how there is a sort of, one of the sort of pitfalls of Black feminism is this need to incessantly defend intersectionality from quote unquote gentrification or co-optation, et cetera, as opposed to sort of innovating and applying it in new ways that really are about ensuring the humanity and flourishing of Black women. Because if we spend all our time, again, in this epistemological struggle that tries to make gender only the purview of women and femmes, it does not serve Black people as a whole, right? It gives us a truncated and a sort of myopic understanding of what's actually happening to our communities, and like, to what end?
And I mean, I think there are different even levels and ways of understanding what the violence is, right? Because the categories of gender, right, the category of masculinity does harm to men in the sort of the way that we understand masculinity, which is based on a particular kind of white male bourgeois masculinity, right? There are a lot of ways that kind of typical understanding of masculinity is outside of the purview of most Black men, right? Don't have the ability to, when masculinity is associated with being able to be a breadwinner, right? Or being able to exert a particular kind of dominance over people like that, or women in particular, that in and of itself does a particular type of harm to Black men in particular, because it's often outside, it's not available to Black men. And so I think even having that kind of basic understanding that these categories that say that based on being a woman or a man, that there are certain types of ways that we have to be in the world. I think for me, that is the way that I have understood gender in general, that when we are confined to being certain types of ways based on what society says a man and a woman is, that in and of itself does a particular kind of harm. And so for me, even that in a very sort of, in the more mundane kind of ways makes sense to me. So again, to this point about sort of just plain old racism, or even understanding what gender violence is, this again, I don't know, these are again, just not new for me to understand this, right?
The other aspect of gender violence we can see through, or the gendered nature of attacks on Black men, is the way that people come for Tommy Curry. And nobody gives a fuck. Nobody defends him, right? This is a full professor under the age of 40, a person who became a full professor, and people who have, and this is not even a sort of meritocracy or elitist thing, but people who are in graduate school or who have no degree whatsoever will really shit on this man in a way that undermines his very meticulous, very diligent research. And I just think that in our current milieu, if white folks did that, we might come to the aid of Black women, but we wouldn't abide that shit if somebody was coming for a Black woman in that way. We see the way that people defend, for example, like, I won't even say any names, other people whose scholarship is far less rigorous, but who are in a accepted intersectional body. And so we defend them. But like, even that is an example of the normalization of violence against Black men that has everything to do with both their race and their gender, period. And this is just uncontroversial at this point, or it's controversial, but it should not be at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying earlier, like when you come into these spaces, like there's even this conversation, like if I'm being honest, I rarely like to pull on like personal anecdotes, but there's this sense of when you're, as a Black man, particularly as a straight Black man, when you're talking about this, you always have to like tread water because you're not being accountable for somebody else's sins, right? Some Black men are never want to be accountable. Like another thing I saw in response to that tweet was like, we're always trying to avoid accountability. And Curry, I think, excites that idea that he's actually willing to push back on some of these things. So he's someone who's just given an excuse for Black men to avoid accountability. Accountability for what exactly is usually a very obscure, some type of amorphous sense of that we're abusive or we're harmful or we don't want to apologize for the sins that we commit within the Black community. Like, so whenever we're in a conversation like this, if you're willing to actually defend yourself, then you're usually going to be branded as a hotep or some type of reactionary, as somebody who probably is secretly an abuser. Like, even having this conversation, like, I can't feel like some of these things aren't going through my mind just being in this conversation, because that's just how I've been in these spaces, and that's how it goes. If you're not willing to just self-deprecate, then you're seen as somehow anti-Black woman. I think, and I know I'm not alone, because these are conversations I've had privately with a lot of Black men who have been in these spaces, but they don't want to say anything because, we see how it goes when somebody speaks up for themselves. And a lot of times I think this is also classed, because when Black men come in these spaces and they don't know all this epistemology, they don't know all the language, they don't know all the privileged talk and all that, and they just speak from their experiences, and they might say something that's imprecise, and they get beat up and they get beat down. I mean, I've literally seen organizers go up to Black men in the streets that are part of Black Lives Matter or something of that nature, and they rush to talk about how we defend all Black people. We're not sexist. We defend queer Black folks, and they only do this when they talk to Black men. When they go talk to other Black people, they don't say that. They don't. That's not their message. So there's this assumption that Black men are somehow rowdy, we're unsophisticated, we're clumsy, we're violent. And a lot of that, I think, is not just gender, but it's also class, because they're usually talking about a particular type of hood nigga or something of that nature. And so a lot of Black men, I think, that to try to not be that, end up having to beat down on their own just to justify or prove that they belong in these spaces, right? And I think a lot of this is extremely harmful, but I've just noticed this for years.
Well, we got your back. Here's the thing. And so this person, Isaiah, like, I think you need to read Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Winter and Audre Lorde before you come to these academic streets. Shut up. I've read all those people. I've read June Jordan. I've read Toni Morrison. I've read Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, Maud White Cass, people y'all ain't even heard of. And I still understand this. And it's because of that I understand these arguments. And because I'm a Black studies scholar and I actually love Black people and I actually love Black intellectuals, I'm not just gonna blindly agree with these people. I'm gonna be like, nope. And I'm also gonna realize that Hortense Spillers is writing in like Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, for example, is a particular type of intervention in a post-structuralist, postmodern milieu. And so this is why she writes in a particular way, and she's making a precise intervention in the 1980s. We can't take people's work transhistorically. We can't take people's work and treat it as gospel. And so again, Jen Nash talks about this being like originalism. And so if we take Black people and Black thinkers seriously, we know well, not only when we disagree, but when some of the shit is fallacious or we've our scholarship has moved forward since then. And so when this person talks about decades of Black feminist thought, okay, fine, right? We're not saying that these were not interventions and innovations and that they're not important in particular ways, but there's some shit that just is not correct, or there's some things that we can disagree with that are equally true from a different ideological or a different sort of political perspective. And so when people try to name drop, to dunk, that's just clout, honey. That's not study. So like, because I've actually read Winter, and as Tommy Curry points out, she has a piece that's called, against bourgeois liberal and Marxist feminism. And again, she does not identify as a feminist, and she talks about classarchy and the constituting analogies and et cetera that are also inscribed in Western or dominant forms of feminism. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it's like, just because you read one Sylvia Winter article and a few poems, like, you're not legend. So don't try to use that to dunk on people.
But one of the things that this is to your point, I think, too, Black, about what it's like to be in organizing spaces, is that I really think a lot of people are really struggling more with their traumas and less with their sort of intellectual understandings of these types of categories, right? And that's not to be dismissive of the types of traumas that people experience and what that means for how they interact with people. But I do think there's something disingenuous because that precise thing that you have experienced, I experienced as the cis heterosexual partner of a cis heterosexual male in those spaces. And it is difficult to, what type of work are we really attempting to do when we say that by virtue of who you come into the room is with your body, that you don't have certain things to say, right? And to me, that's a contradiction, because in the same way that queer people don't want to be silenced in these spaces, that same type of silencing is happening based on what you understand to be other people's normative ways of being in the world, right? And so to me, I think that we have to disentangle our own traumas from what it means to actually have intellectual, critical analyses of these categories of gender and being and belonging in relationship to structures of power. And I think that is often what the mismatch is in these places.
Yeah, and so Erica, word to Erica Keynes, word to Hood Communist, she has like a piece about lived experience and how lived experience ain't enough. That shit ain't enough. It can be a compliment. And again, this is like a Black feminist innovation alongside like standpoint epistemology. Again, it's not irrelevant, but it's not that can't be the only thing you're bringing to a conversation to invalidate facts, empirical facts at that. So.
Yeah, there's just a lot of tropes that get thrown around. What was it? I think Jamal got a lot of these. Straight Black men are the white people of Black people. Black men experience racism, not sexism, which we already talked about. Black men have power and privilege because they're males. Straight Black men are the weakest link and the main barrier to Black liberation. I know that last one was a false Angela Davis quote that I remember was floating around that she never even wrote. And people were running with that she said we were us and white women were the weakest link, and she never said that. I don't even know who made it up. But like this type of ideas dominate the conversation, and I even when it comes to accountability, it's not to say that Black men don't have things to be accountable for like everyone else. Like, I'm never here to say that we're somehow scot free, but that doesn't mean that we have to constantly apologize for what happened to somebody. And I just feel like that's really what it is. And if you buck that, like I said, you're seen as some type of reactionary or problematic or whatever. Even if you have, like you were saying with Curry, even if you have all the facts, you've read all the books, you've read the feminists that these so-called feminists haven't even read. Because I've had the same conversations where I'm like talking to people about intersectionality, and it's like, they never even read Mapping the Margins or any of this stuff. And I'm like, if you look at some of the citations, she's really bigging up liberalism, and she's quoting feminists who, essentially were saying that Black men were deviants. Like, this is the stuff that she's citing in the piece. And then she doesn't actually prove a lot of the claims that she's making. It's more of an intuitive argument. And it doesn't matter how much I bring that up. A personal experience always trumps it in this case. But if I bring my personal experience into something, whatever that personal experience may be, then that doesn't seem to hold as much weight, and it just doesn't make sense to me.
And also word to queer socialism for, for this discourse. I mean, I think that you late to this revelation, no offense, but I do appreciate you sort of, introducing it into the Twitterverse, and because it seems like there was a lot of good engagement.
I think what's even more important in this is being able to publicly acknowledge and I think not be shamed for progression and not sort of linear progression, but progression in thought, to be able to say, I held a position and I have encountered things that have made me shift my position. And to me, that's the mark of a true intellectual, is to be able to not dogmatically hold on to things because it's something we believe, but to continue to engage in these sort of intellectual debates and dialogues, and actually be able and be willing to publicly shift our opinions about things, and be able to publicly shift our stances. And so even, it's like, I know we kind of talked, we didn't go through this because I don't think it's necessary to go through the whole thread, but some people were like, okay, well, you need to apologize to, Tommy Curry or whatever. And I mean, I think that that's fine. You can say those things, but I think that I don't think that we should be engaged in the business of shaming people for publicly acknowledging how their positions on things have changed, because I think that is what we should all be striving to do, is actually genuinely engage in these debates and dialogues in order to have clearer understandings of these things.
Black women and femmes, Black non-males, listen. We lose nothing by acknowledging the gender nature and understanding the gender nature of what Black men experience. We lose nothing. It doesn't decenter us, although I'm in the margins anyway, because the center is where you get smoked. But it doesn't invalidate our experience. It doesn't say, it actually says nothing about women. It doesn't have to. We don't have to make, there can be something that are just about Black men. They can have Black male studies. It's fine. It doesn't take away from what the fuck we doing. And in fact, we are them. They are us. We're Africans. Like, we are all Africans. And so I really, and I got dragged on Twitter last time I talked about the gender wars, but listen, like, at a certain point, I think that we can accept that, we can hold space for both. And I think that we're going to need both in this liberation struggle period. And so I really just want to impress that, like, we lose nothing by acknowledging this really objective fact.
Okay, y'all. So for this week's planting thoughts, we have the Zambiaculus zamifolia, or the ZZ plant. This one is a hardy one. So for all of you, I know a lot of you are like, I see y'all writing out there in the Twitterverse and the social medias, like, I don't know what to do. My plants are dying. This one is a hardy one for you. Okay, so this one is native to Eastern and Southern Africa. One thing, I haven't been telling y'all this about the other plants, and I need to make sure I do this. So this one in particular is poisonous for pets. And I guess, well, it's poisonous in general. So if you got little kids running around or pets, make sure this is not one of the ones that they're chewing on. But this one is super easy to care for. Like, it is damn near impossible to kill. I mean, you can't kill it. You can overwater it and those type of things. But so this one survives in low light. It thrives in higher light. So the more light it gets, the more that it will sort of grow. So this one has been sitting in my windowsill because it's hella gray here. This one, what's interesting about the ZZ is that it has these like tuber root systems that sort of hold the nutrients. So they're like these kind of big bulbous balls below the surface that hold the roots. It can be propagated through the stems or the leaves. But this one is just a really, I think, easy. It can grow pretty big, pretty full. Like, I've had this one for maybe 2 months, and it's gotten fuller even just since I've had it here. But this one is one for you all who are struggling with your indoor plants. This one can give you a lot of pleasure, give you a lot of green in your house without too much work. So the ZZ. All All right, everybody. So I am very excited for this interview today. As you all know, Venezuela is a place that has a special place in my heart. And this week we get to focus on Latin America and the upcoming and previous elections for this week's show. So we have two very special guests today, Flavia Marquez and George Chicarillo Mayer. So Flavia holds a Bachelor of Foreign Relations from the Central University of Venezuela and has served as a career diplomat at the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry since 2002. She is a member of the group of diplomats who returned to Venezuela following the January 2019 embassy crisis and the sort of dissolution of diplomatic relations between the US and Venezuela. She is currently the Commissioner for International Relations and Social Struggles of the Platform of the Anti-Imperialist Working Class, the PCOA. She is the Adjunct Secretary for the International Cumbre of Afro-Descendants and the Foreign Relations Advisor to the first Vice President of the National Assembly of Venezuela. Gio Mayer is an organizer, writer, radical political theorist, and visiting associate professor at Vassar College. He has been visiting scholar at the Decolonizing Humanities Project at the College of William and Mary, the Hemispheric Institute in New York, and the Institute of Social Research at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He's also taught previously at Drexel, Berkeley, San Quentin Prison, and the Venezuelan School of Planning in Caracas. His 2013 book, A History of Revolutionary Movements in Venezuela, We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, was personally hugely important for me when I was doing my own dissertation research. He has a few later works, his 2016 work, Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela, his 2017 work, Decolonizing Dialectics, and his most recent book, A World Without Police. I actually have all of them, but the other ones are at my office. This one is actually at home with me at the moment. His public scholarship can be found in a number of places, including but not limited to The Nation, Jacobin, Counterpunch, Venezuela Analysis, The Philadelphia Inquirer, Latin American Perspectives, Contemporary Political Theory, Monthly Review, Radical Philosophy Review, and the Journal of Black Studies. He is also an avid translator of Latin American decolonial theory and has translated several books and articles by thinkers like Enrique Dussel and Anibal Quijano, among others. So I am so happy to have you all here today, and I'm very excited about this conversation.
Oh, thanks for having both of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks both of you for being here. I'm just gonna get started with this first question. So this can go to anyone, but earlier this summer, Alex Saab was detained in Cape Verde, and on October 16th was extradited to the U.S. despite the fact that two countries have no extradition treaty, on a series of money laundering charges. Just last week, 7/8 of those charges have been dropped. Could you tell us who Alex Saab is and why this case has drawn international attention at this moment?
Well, good morning. Thank you. Well, Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat who was traveling abroad, fulfilling a mission, a humanitarian mission, to bring food and medicines for Venezuela and also oil. He had his diplomatic passport and he has all the papers that accredited him as such. And he was detained in Cape Verde last year when the airplane when he was traveling to Iran was stopping to refill the tank. So they said the authorities in Cape Verde said that they had an alert for a red alert. And at the end, we have been finding out that there are a lot of irregularities in his detention. First, this red alert, so-called, arrived the day after he was detained by the police in Cape Verde. Second, it wasn't his name, the correct name on that supposed alert. And after that, well, they are violating, of course, all the Vienna Convention and agreement because he had a diplomat passport and he was traveling as a diplomat accredited to the African Union. So of course we have been seeing, and I think it's clear in the media that this is a political motivated case. He was able to give an interview to CNN, and in that interview he was able to explain that he was under pressure for the authorities. He was tortured actually, and they offered him a deal to plead guilty of money laundering for Nicolas Maduro as a narco terrorist. Which he of course denied, and he didn't accept the deal. That's why later on, just the day before the new government in Cape Verde took office, which is a lefty government that said that he was going to free Alex Saab, the day before they took office, he was deported to the US, which is also another irregularity because those two countries do not have a treaty of extradition. So Alex Saab is a political prisoner in the States. Today, Monday, he's having the first hearing at 9 a.m. He had it this morning. And well, he hasn't been allowed to see, of course, his family. The family was deported from Cape Verde and they are not allowed in the US. All his human rights are being violated. And all that he was doing was buying legally food and medicines and also oil for Venezuela because of the sanctions that we have been undergoing already for so many years, but especially after the last administration of Trump. I don't know if George would like to add something.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, Alex Saab he's a businessman. He's originally Colombian and has been involved in import-export activity in conjunction with the Venezuelan government for many years. I think it's important, to understand that we don't, here's someone who is a private, importer exporter who's made lots and lots of money doing this over the years. We don't need to act as if, he is, necessarily, the most revolutionary figure in and of himself. But the question is why over the past 10, 15 years, out of all that period, why all of a sudden does Alex Saab become a target at this moment? And it's because as the US ratcheted up this blockade, their goal, of course, is to strangle the Venezuelan economy, to cause even more deaths than the already 40,000 deaths that have been sort of estimated by a previous report. And that was even prior to this wave of sanctions. They want to make the Venezuelan people suffer to the point, and this is even, US lawmakers will use this language, they'll say to the point where they themselves are willing to overthrow the government. And this is the Chilean model. This is the model that happens all across the globe. And what was Alex Saab doing? He was playing a key role in getting food to Venezuela, getting medicine to Venezuela. Part of what this sanctions regime did was made it impossible to directly import and export food. It also made it impossible to use financial instruments to make payments for international trade. And it made it very, very difficult to ensure ships that would be carrying the goods to and from the country. This was an attempt to totally blockade the economy. This does a number of things. It makes, first of all, it pushes, Venezuela and those who are trying to break the blockade into different strategies and tactics. It creates new criminal categories. Let's be real about that. All of a sudden, you're so-called violating, something that the U.S. has just invented and imposed on the country, and the U.S. wants to criminalize that activity as well. And I think finally, and most importantly, what Saab was, played a major role in was supplying food to what were called the CLAPs, which were these direct distribution mechanisms that were established to directly feed the Venezuelan people in the moments of the highest level of crisis, right? Whether the supermarkets are, shut down, where there's, opposition, demonstrations and protests and blockades. And the CLAPs began to distribute food in this economic crisis period directly to people's doorsteps to make it available to them, and was a major threat, right? Not only to the Venezuelan opposition, but also to the US government's plans of really starving the people. So this is why he comes into the crosshairs, not only of the US, but also of the domestic opposition. They start to raise all these claims against him, writing about him. And again, we don't have to think that he's the purest person on earth to know that he has been targeted because of this, blockade, breaking activity that he's been engaged in.
that, you mentioned that 7 of the 8 charges against him were dropped. And that's why, as George said, of course, he's not, the most innocent in the world, but he actually had a trial in Sweden years ago because of the funding and all the businesses he does, and he was found out innocent. So that's why also it doesn't make any sense of that money laundering charges they wanted to make. Of course, the only charge they are giving him is conspiracy, which is very broad. And as we know, we don't need proof to say someone told me he was conspiring of whatever they want. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also add, not so much about Alex Saab, but about the way the sanctions operate. I think sometimes people don't always understand that even countries that don't necessarily have antagonistic relations with Venezuela are struggling to even engage in any kind of commerce between Venezuela because of the complicated and confusing way that the sanctions are imposed, right? And the ways that other countries can be implicated if there is some link in the chain that is affiliated with Venezuela, right? And so I think that that's another thing to understand about the point you made, Gio, about the sanctions being used to sort of choke out the popular support for what's actually happening in the country, is to make people so miserable, right? And to make even countries that don't necessarily have issues with Venezuela unable to engage in sort of basic, humanistic trading practices, right? So I guess prior to Alex Saab's sort of detainment capture, Maduro was reportedly in negotiation talks with some of the opposition forces inside of the country. And I know that at the moment when Saab was captured, Maduro decided to pull out of those negotiation talks. And so I wanted to ask you all both, where do those negotiation talks kind of stand? What is the current nature of the conflict between the sort of PSUV and the opposition forces inside the country?
It's true. So talks were broken off, and the talks had been centering on this question for a long time. The question of Alex Saab had been a condition for the talks. And of course the government walked out. I think Flavio might be able to say more about the precise nature of what was being discussed. My sense, though, is that the main goal from the perspective of the Venezuelan government maybe was accomplished, which is that the Venezuelan opposition will be participating in these elections, will not be able to claim, and I know we'll talk about this in a few minutes, will not be able to claim this sort of victim status of being, not by boycotting the elections. And that, I think, sets the stage for, restabilizing the political system in a really important way moving forward. So I think they've already accomplished that, right, in those talks.
Yeah, as George said, that's like the main goal, and we made that happen. That have been helping the situation internally and abroad, as the image of the country have changed because we moved. So that made possible that the European Union is here now as an observer. We have other organizations of the area also as observers like the UN, but also we have from the Parliament of Mercosur, they are coming for the elections because they realize it is a real election. And all the factors, so-called factors, are participating. The dialogues stopped. President Maduro says he will think about it. He will see if we come back. There are no final words here regarding that. I saw a note of the U.S. Secretary meeting with the Norwegian representation of the Mexico. That's 3 days ago. They were talking about Venezuela. They published that on Twitter. So the negotiations are alive, but they know what they did with Alex Saab was a move that affected. They knew that we will affect. The opposition, though, the ones, the special radicals that are outside the country, so-called exiled by themselves, are trying to sabotage it. For instance, the European Union agreed on coming on the elections with Euro parliamentarians of all the factions, including the Leopoldo Lopez father. And the last week they said they won't be participating, but they are alone because all of the factors of the European Union are coming to Venezuela this week on Wednesday, I think they are arriving. So we are going forward. We think we're going to have a very good election. I think negotiations in Mexico will be resuming after elections. Let's see, and they will go forward, but certainly we need to watch closely what is going on with Alex Saab trial.
Right. So, so coming up here soon, regional and municipal elections will be taking place in Venezuela this Sunday, actually, on November 21st. As I understand it, this will be the first election since 2015 where the opposition forces have decided to abandon their boycott strategy and have largely united under MUD for Americans. That's Democratic Unity Roundtable and Democratic Alliance tickets. So why is this election so important, and what is generally at stake? I know you kind of spoke to some of that already, but if either one of you could expand on it some.
Yeah, it's crucial, and it's crucial to begin to, stabilize. What was an economic crisis, what was a moment of aggression going back to 2014, 2015, became really a political crisis and a constitutional crisis that required the seating of a constituent assembly to break a deadlock. It required, a series of maneuvers to pacify what were incredibly bloody protests in the streets by these opposition forces. And we're still, I think, coming out of that period, right? And the next step is to get people to admit that they're willing to participate in these elections. And listen, the Venezuelan opposition from the beginning has been divided between this sort of participationist and abstentionist wings. And the abstentionists are the hardline right-wing radicals who want to do everything they can to discredit the system, to discredit the government, and who also know that they, by and large, this goes back to the very beginning, they knew they would lose, right? So they didn't want to participate. So they wanted to boycott rather than lose. And then they could claim that they were excluded from the political system. And these wings have always been here. The abstentionist wing definitely won out over the past few years, but at a certain point, there's very little they can do because there are many strategies to overthrow the government. They're calling for U.S. intervention, attempting to create these crises along the border with so-called fake humanitarian aid, in an economic crisis that they themselves were producing. It didn't work, right? And so they've had to reorient themselves. And the good thing is that they're coming back to the table. But also they're coming back with their classic divisions, right? They can't agree among themselves. They never have been able to. They're all, their leaders are a pack of elites who all want power for themselves. They never agree, they're disagreeing. And this disagreement divides the opposition, which is why you've got different opposition forces coming and running in these elections, which probably bodes pretty well for the Chavistas. Of course, in the context of an economic crisis, and really the one that's been rolling for several years now, voters can be very unpredictable in which way they swing. And, of course, the enthusiasm for Chavismo has dropped over recent years, which is something that always happens in moments of economic crisis. So it will be a good, an important, election to watch for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And regarding Venezuela, most of the elections we celebrate, this is election 27, I think, there are always a legitimation step or process for the government. It doesn't matter if there are parliamentarian, regional, presidentials. It's always about, it's going to happen, it's going to be free and fair, etc. So this one especially important because of what happened with Guaido. And the first step to de-escalate the situation were the parliamentarian elections in 2020. And that divided even more, as George said, the opposition is always divided. This divided deeply the opposition. It's almost like they are atoms now between the historical political parties like Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, which is one of the oldest party, they divided. So what is going on? Part of them, they didn't participate in the parliamentarian elections because they were trying to support the craziness from the Guaido lovers, as we call them. They try to extend the mandate of the National Assembly, being parliamentarian still. That didn't work. In the foreign countries, they try to support it, but it's ridiculous because it's against any law, the constitution and all the laws in Venezuela, and it's very contradictory for them. So they have suffered kind of a stop in their political life, and they are not allowing that. So in this election, we have all the factors like Voluntad Popular, they divided, they are participating. We have Primero Justicia, we have a new CNE. So all the conditions are met, so they can say no and they cannot retire. They are tied to this and they don't want to lose their space in the scenario, in the political scenario, because they see that the parliamentarians that got elected in 2020, they are doing political life. They are traveling, they are bringing, and they don't want to be outsiders. And they will be winning some governorships and some mayorships also in the country, as they did when they won in 2015. So they cannot say the system is not working or it's not fair or it's not just. And it will be interesting what is going on. And until now, they haven't retired. They just changed a candidate because they cannot agree among themselves. And in Caracas, they are super divided among the same parties. So that's all the news we have. Like they had to change to one candidate. But yeah, and they will be winning, especially in the states that are border states, like Zulia and Táchira, probably, which are border with Colombia. But it's going to be very interesting. And we have all the observers we haven't had in the past this time. So let's see. I think it will be a good output.
So that's interesting to think about what is happening on the other side of the spectrum, right? So we know that the Bolivarian project has enjoyed increasingly, even if it's only sort of incrementally less support since Chavez died in 2013. And that it has become worse, not so much, partially because of some decisions that have been made at governmental levels, but also because of the economic downturn and been made even worse by COVID, right? And so one of the things we know is happening in this particular election is that there is even a group that considers itself to the left of the PSUV, which is the Popular Revolutionary Alternative. So could you all tell us a little bit more about this development and what the sort of distinctions are between the sort of mainstream PSUV and this kind of left of PSUV alternative?
Yeah, and this is, again, just as the opposition has always had its divisions, Chavismo has always had its its currents as well. But whereas the opposition is very good at losing, Chavismo has always been very good at winning, and bringing these currents together. And so the dynamic has played out, I think, in a lot of different ways. Again, there have been people from the very beginning who have run within Chavismo as a critical current. There have been periods where they stepped outside, people even running against Chavez for president, union leaders, others, starting different parties. The Communist Party has a long and dignified trajectory of independent struggle, and so has also run candidates sometimes within and sometimes outside of the PSU. And so in a way, this isn't anything new. It certainly emerged, and in the moments of crisis of the past couple of years, there's been a greater push to really try to create a full alternative outside of the PSUV. And I think maybe that moment has passed a little bit, although of course these candidates are out there, and I don't think the process loses anything by having them and having them win and show what they can do in terms of governing. I think it's important though to pay just as much attention, if not more, to critical currents within the PSUV. Those radical leaders who have been struggling against party bureaucracy, struggling against institutionalized leadership, to win a space within the party, right? One I think that is always worth mentioning is Ángel Prado, the spokesperson of the El Maizal commune in Barquisimeto, who is standing as for the mayorship of Simón Planas municipality, and really has become a focal point for radical grassroots Chavismo and the struggle of the communes, which has very often been a struggle against elements of the party, against the private sector, and against political leadership. This again, so in the context of Chavismo being in power all these years and winning, this has been a much more productive dynamic than it has been for the opposition, where the grassroots has been able to sort of mobilize and as a result put pressure on and create a sort of a productive dynamic within the Bolivarian revolution, radicalizing the demands of the grassroots, which have suffered some setbacks in the past few years. There's been some privatization of state-run enterprise. There's been a tendency to embrace the national bourgeoisie instead of embracing the grassroots participatory communes, and so this is a struggle, but it's one that's been able to be had within Chavismo, and hopefully there'll be some dynamism coming out of this election for that project from below as well.
Yeah, that certainly so. Regarding the Chavismo, it has certainly lost some of the support they have, but I could say, living in Venezuela, you could see as soon as President Chavez died, the dissent started to appear in letters, voices, and I respect that. I'm not criticizing, but you could see that as older people expressed their dissent and left, younger people have come. And this is a surprise even for me, because you would think the younger would be more attracted, to what the US and other external could sell you as models. As we can see in the opposition, we saw so many young people supporting the opposition, confused, or because they didn't even think about what is alternative. It was just going against the system or against what established. But now you see in the PSUV, the young people in the PSUV, they are inside, they are very active, not only in Caracas, but outside, and they are like the principal movement of the party. So there is not an increase, but it has been an increase in the younger level of the bases. I just wanted to say that. On the other hand, we have the PCB inside the National Assembly. They have one parliamentarian elected. They managed to get elected. They have their voice raised in all the sessions and the official sessions of the National Assembly, and it's very important. I agree with that. I like it because we need criticism and outside the PSUV, because we are, as George said, we're very good with it because we are very disciplined. But sometimes discipline is confused with being silent, and I'm not. I don't agree with that. You need to say what you need to say from your point of view. In my case, for the Afros, for instance, we have 2 Afro parliamentarians there, and only the Afros could see it the way they see it, even though all of them could agree, in the socialist point of view. On the other hand, I also wanted to add that for this election, let's see, I think we would have surprises with these parties, even though the main issue where they disagree, as George also said, and you all know, is because of the economics. The main criticism they have explained internally and also internationally is they don't think the economy has been well managed. They wanted more socialism. Regarding the communes in particular, the National Assembly just approved the project for communes, but it has resistance. Even though it is the National Assembly and the PSUV is the majority, we know it will meet resistance from inside because of governance, because it goes against the system, period. So the resistance is inside the government too. The government is proposing, is approving, is giving everything. The President Maduro is pushing this project, but we know it will meet this these barriers inside from the PSUV, especially in the governorships and in the municipalities. But there, I think will be very important, all these new radical movement left to the left, in order to make it happen, as President Chavez always said.
All right, yeah, thank you for that. Switching gears to another Latin American country under attack, and the elections more specifically. Nicaragua also recently held elections. As usual, the U.S. and its allies are attempting to discredit the outcome of this election and recently passed the Renacer Act, the acronym. The U.S. loves their acronyms, reinforcing Nicaragua's adherence to conditions for Electoral Reform Act, authorizing another regime of sanction for corruption and human rights abuses in Nicaragua. We know that Venezuela and Cuba have been the target of similar sanctions for some time now. Could you speak to the broader implications of this moment, where the so-called pink tide seems to be flowing or perhaps trickling once again, and the particular role sanctions play in attempting to quell popular support for left social movements in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a few things. One is I could come up with a lot of bad things to say about Daniel Ortega. I think it's very difficult to compare the leadership of Nicaragua to the leadership of Venezuela. I think the leadership of Venezuela represents a far more ambitious, radical political process of change. But none of that excuses the fact that the U.S. aggression attempts to overthrow these governments, but also, and I think as you pointed to rightly, the fact that sanctions are a new weapon for doing that, right? Not entirely new, of course, but I think we should engage in some analysis of why it is that sanctions have become such a widespread strategy. Of course, it doesn't require troops on the ground. Of course, it can be used in very flexible and different ways. And part of what the U.S. is doing is to claim that they are through these sanctions, working on behalf of the Nicaraguan people or the Venezuelan people. They name people, right? So they claim they're working to target specific people, Alex Saab, Venezuelan government officials, and say, oh, no, we actually support the people on the grassroots level. We're just targeting these individuals. Well, that's what Obama said too. And as Vijay Prashad rightly put it, Obama made the spear and then Trump threw it into the heart of Venezuela, right? Because it was these sanctions that Obama had started that have killed many tens of thousands. Again, we don't even know how many. And so it's also part of the US's strategy of washing its hands of the actual implications of its policy.
Totally agree. And also I could add that after Chavez died, we know United States thought they were coming for Venezuela because Venezuela was only about Chavez, and the same happened to the other countries. Yeah. They tried to topple governments one by one because they thought the only thing that could bring them together was Chavez and Chavismo. But if that were so, you would see protests in the Nicaraguan people like since years. Yeah. Until now, and that is not happening. So that is what they are trying to trigger with the sanctions, as they did in Venezuela twice with these so-called guarimbas. They have also, we remember that when in Venezuela erupted the last guarimbas, they also had them in Nicaragua. They are trying the same script for both countries. And well, the thing is exactly, Nicaragua is not Venezuela, it's different, but let's see what happened. We know this election won't be credited. It will happen like with Maduro. They didn't want to recognize last election. It will be in the hands of the Nicaraguan government to play it right. This movement against Nicaragua has been building for years. I remember when Ileana Ros-Lehtinen was still in US Congress, in the House, she was talking about this. At the same time, she was talking about Venezuela. And I remember diplomats in Washington from those countries believed they were not going after them, like Bolivians because they have a good economy, or Nicaraguans because they play nicely diplomatically. And look what happened years after. They are coming at all of them. And they need to realize this in order to have an effective policy internally and also in Washington specifically, where things are, we know all the things are broader.
Certainly. And I think, it's one of the things that has been interesting to me about the Venezuelan case since I became aware of it is this sort of internal dynamic, which you both have pointed to, that there's no necessarily like undifferentiated belief that things are perfect or that everyone's voice is heard all the time, but that there is a willingness to struggle, right? And that is what I think even on this show we've constantly talked about, even in the case of Nicaragua, right? Regardless of what we from sitting outside think might be the right or wrong place to go, what is certainly the case is that the people themselves have a right to choose that for themselves, right? And that we do not, whether it's we the people or the government of the United States, do not have the right to sort of make these decisions for people, right? And so that's one of the things one of the reasons why I've continued to follow the Bolivarian Revolution in this kind of context. So I wanted to end lastly, here on the Last Up Intellectual, we like to always center the experiences of Black people, of people of African descent. And so I wanted to ask Fravia, and perhaps George, you can speak to this too. So I know, Fravia, you are working with the International Anti-Imperialist Kumbe of Africans and Afro-Descendants. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work of the Kumbe, and could you give us a sense of the relationship between the sort of Afro-Venezuelan community at large, particularly the Afro-Venezuelan community that sees itself in sort of struggle and conversation with the Bolivarian project, and sort of what's at stake there?
Thank you, Leila. Yeah, well, the Kumbe was an initiative, it's an organization, a platform that brings together several organizations that was founded in 2019 after the International Congress of Afro-Descendants in Venezuela. And it brings together young people, which are like in the higher levels, but also takes in account all the researchers and all the long time, people that have worked in the Afro issues like Jesus Chucho Garcia, that is the most known, I think, internationally speaking, and others as an advisors. The Kumbe is trying to organize among regions like European, African, Latin America, Caribbean regions, having different nucleus or secretariats to bring together the issues, not only to spread the voice of the Afro-Venezuelans and speak to the people about our realities, but to bring together all the struggles and visibilize the struggles of our brothers and sisters abroad. So we having had several meetings. We are bringing electoral observers for the elections. We are present in every international congress or gathering that is being held in Venezuela as such. And we were able as a movement finally to have, as I said before, 2 congresswomen inside the National Assembly for the first time. As you all may know, we already have a racism law against racism that was passed in 2012. And recently, 3 weeks ago, we had a reform to improve that. But since there are different, I would say, sectors of the society inside the National Assembly, because the first one was indigenous peoples, now is the Afro, we still have differences. Even though we are from the PSUV, most of the Afro movement is inside the PSUV, we still have differences and we wanted more of that law. But we are struggling internally to bring up the issue and bring up the awareness. We still need a lot of education regarding the Afro. After the pandemic, the Afro communities were the most affected, I think, in the whole world was the same, but especially in Venezuela. We are struggling to have more people in offices and organizing to achieve so. And still we have some resistance from the government. There's people that do not understand. They say it is color because of color, like the phenotype, because what you look like, and not because there is an issue. We still are struggling with that positions inside the PSUV and in Venezuela. But I think we have had more young people involved. And I hope you come back to Venezuela, Laila, you in particular, because you were here earlier this year, so you can see the awareness in the people. Now they recognize their roots. They are starting to dress like and recognize we can be different and empowered, not only because it's, like a fashion, because of fashion, but because you recognize we're different and we need different outcomes, because we still have the majority of the Afro population is bigger than the white population in jail, as is in the States and in other countries. Like, raise all these issues, but it takes time. And I hope, especially from the National Assembly, I'm helping these 2 congresswomen with the parliamentarians, friendship groups, and with other initiatives, so we can bring this issue in every law and in every space we can target through the National Assembly.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just add, I mean, that's great. And I would add, Leila, as you know, I talk about the history of struggles around white supremacy in Venezuela, and the fact that at the beginning, most Chavistas just ignored the question, right? And acted like it wasn't a problem. This is very much an ideology across Latin America that was heavy in Venezuela as well, that we're all mixed. There's no racism, there's no race here. And it took the struggle within Chavismo by organizations like the Afro-Venezuelan Network, just through conversations with Chucho Garcia and others, to force the question, right? To make it, central, and to force Chavez himself to embrace, his identity as Afro-Indigenous and say, this is who we are, right? This is the real, basis of this revolutionary process. And this wasn't just about inclusion. Also, these were the organizations that were that were on the cutting edge of recognizing some of the reactionary tendencies, for example, in policing in Venezuela, pushing back on, the criminalization of the poor, pushing back on the Venezuelan government had brought out Bill Bratton as an advisor to the police, right? And it was the Afro-Venezuelan movements that resisted this pushback and really forced this, this question. And again, this is an indication of that central dynamic where the pushing within and specifically from the most oppressed sectors is key to, you just harnessing, this power and driving the process forward. And it just requires that those movements can continue to struggle, continue to push within, and that the leadership not become so ossified that it can't recognize and be a conveyor of this. Because Chavez was so incredible at being flexible and and reflecting what it was that the grassroots needed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what has been so important, even for me, is so my first visit to Venezuela was in 2011, and the number of conversations that I, had with people who were like, like, there are no Black people here, right? And so like there are these basic shifts that I think have happened in the sort of general discourse. But then I think what was really important to me as I saw the Kumbe form was the fact that it was formed particularly around the question of Afro-descendant people on the left, right? And thinking about people of African descent as a political bloc, as opposed to some of the ways that people of African descent have generally been relegated to the position of culture, right? So that, it's not just about the tambores de San Juan or, food or other kinds of things, right? That there is actually a sort of political and ideological formation that underlines the experiences of people of African descent and the way that they want to relate to the Bolivarian Revolution. And so that is what I think is an important sort of moment, and I hope to sort of see that continue to grow. And I don't know if there are any last things that you all would like to say or share before we close, but I want to thank you both. And hopefully, this interview will air just before the elections take place. So we shall see. Maybe we will have a follow-up conversation after the elections. So I want to say thank you to both of you all for being here today.
Thanks to you, Laila. It has been amazing for me to be with George Cicarello. Imagine that. I also only see him in TV. I was very excited to be with him.
Thank you all
Afraid
for
to
setting
be
this
at
up.
his
It's been
level.
great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so we are continuing on with our Latin America centered episode, and today we have a close family friend of mine, Bamboshi Shango, who was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and has been a community, labor, student organizer, Pan-Africanist solidarity and peace organizer since he arrived in the US in the 1960s. He has traveled in Africa, Europe, North, South, and Central America, and the Caribbean. Mboshi has spoken for and represented many organizations and coalitions on campuses, conferences, delegations, seminars, community meetings, and at international manifestations, and has done numerous radio and television interviews. Mboshi is currently a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC, a member of the board of directors of the Alliance for Global Justice, and past co-director of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, and as well as a past co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. He has traveled to Cuba and Venezuela on numerous occasions. He was an election observer to the December 2020 Venezuela National Assembly elections, and most recently, a member of the election accompaniment delegation to the November 6, 2021 Nicaragua election. He is currently based in Oklahoma City, and he is here today to give us a report back or live from the streets about the most recent elections in Nicaragua.
Thank you for being with us. All right, so the first question we got here is Nicaragua just held elections on November 7, 2001. Can you speak about why these elections were so important, especially in the context of attempts by the US, the UK, and other Western powers to construe them as illegitimate and to discredit Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista National Liberation Front?
Let me say that the United States government and the United States in particular have seen Venezuela, Nicaragua, countries throughout South and Central America as their backyard and their property, their possession. And to show you how much that has affected the American psyche, if you look back in the 1860s, there was a man from Tennessee named Williams who actually went down with a small army and invaded Nicaragua in the 1860s and declared himself president. And he actually lasted there for a whole year before he was thrown out. And then he came back again a couple of months later, tried to invade, and the US arrested him, brought him back to America. And then he tried to invade Honduras, and the British captured him, and he was executed. But that is the kind of mentality that has driven the US relationship with South and Central America and the Caribbean, that this is their property that's just sitting there and they can go and do whatever they want with it. And so the US actually invaded Nicaragua in the 1930s. And they established a neo-colonial regime. The first Somoza, the father of the last Somoza president, was assassinated there in Nicaragua. And 4 years later, his son became the president. And he was president until he was overthrown by the Sandinista revolution in the 1980s. And he fled, of course, first to Miami, and then he ended up in Paraguay, where he also was assassinated. And I don't think we could say he was assassinated by the left, because Paraguay, like the rest of Nicaragua, the rest of South America and Central America, were and are, for the most part, still neo-colonies. Those countries that are not controlled and beholden to the United States are under threats of regime change by the US, like currently Venezuela, currently Cuba, of course, Nicaragua. And so this is a continuation of a long struggle. The Sandinista was able to come to power in Nicaragua because they presented a new, different, and better way for the people of Nicaragua. And they won the first guerrilla warfare in the 1980s. Of course, you know what happened after that between the CIA, Ronald Reagan, the US military supporting a Contra war that created so much debt that the Sandinistas were forced to go for elections, and the people of Nicaragua voted for a neo-colonial woman because they wanted to stop the debt and destruction. But the Sandinista came back to power in 2007. And this Sandinista is who the people voted for last Sunday. Well, yeah, last Sunday, the 6th. And it was this Sandinista that won the elections on Sunday that the United States keeps saying was not fair and was not transparent. We just want to say that we were there as a part of a 134-person international observer brigade to go from polling place to polling place to see if there were issues, if there were problems, if the votes were being stolen, that kind of stuff. And what we saw was the completely opposite of what the US news media continued to push. What we saw was something that makes us say very clearly that Biden is either clairvoyant or he is a liar. And we think the last statement is probably true, because he called the Nicaraguan election unfair. He accused the Nicaraguans of arresting people and beating people in the streets and all kinds of stuff. None of that took place. We saw people who went to church and came out of the church and went to vote. We saw people who we spoke to who told us, look, we voted for the Sandinista because since 2007, our lives have changed. We have gotten so much improvement that there was no reason for us to vote for anybody else. Again, Trump said that, you know, the Nicaraguan Sandinista government ran alone and nobody else ran. That's not true. There were 6 other candidates for president, and they all lost. And in talking to people who came out from the polling place, they were saying that in 2020, Nicaragua was hit by 2 major hurricanes, a Category 4 and a Category 5 hurricane, and that many people lost shelters, they lost electricity, and that within 1 week, the government had replaced electricity, and they will continue working on repairing shelters, and most people had shelters repaired before the end of the month. And so that was the reason they voted for the Sandinistas in this election. Also, they took a comparison and a contrast to Puerto Rico, who was also hit by a major hurricane in 2018. And in Puerto Rico, they still don't have electricity. So people voted their interests. They voted for what they saw and what they understood the Sandinista has done for them.
You told us a little bit about what it's been like in terms of the outcome on the ground, but could you also give us a sense, do you know what the actual voter turnout numbers were like in terms of participation?
Yes. Again, in the US, they measure voter turnout by the people who actually come to vote. In Nicaragua, they measure voter turnout by the number of people who are qualified to vote, which include people from the ages of 17 up. And they had a 74.9% turnout. And out of that 74.9%, the Sandinista government received 64.4, I think, percent of the vote. So there was no question who won. But because Nicaragua has not towed the line that the US wants towed, because Nicaragua has assisted Venezuela and assisted Cuba, they have been marked for regime change also. And this process you can see continuing today. On the 15th, the US has financed groups of young people and cultural workers inside of Cuba to create demonstrations that they say are anti-government. They had a demonstration back in August that I think most folks have heard about. And in this demonstration, a number of Cubans took to the streets, and they took to the streets for 2 reasons. One, they was hard hit by the pandemic, and 2, they was even harder hit by US sanctions. And we must be clear that sanctions is an act of war. Sanctions is an act of war that killed more women and children in the countries that it is applied to than the dropping of bombs. And these women and children are not military, they're civilians. So, you know, it's not only an act of war, it's a war crime. And the US currently has about 36 countries that are under some form of sanction. And these countries, I would hope, will unite to fight the sanctions, because the United States is not invincible.
Yeah, thank you for that. Next question. This isn't on our list, but I wanted to ask this question. I want to see if I can integrate it into the question that we have coming up. There's been claims of Ortega and the regime basically gelling all the opposition, and I know you had said there was opposition parties that ran. So I was curious if you could speak to that, because even in certain left media in the U.S., I won't state any names, but they've claimed that he's been like a month-long crackdown. It's a direct quote.
Yes, we call it the right wing left, but that statement is not entirely true. They were people who were arrested. These people, the majority of them had not filed to run for anything, but they did represent certain political parties, and they were not arrested because they were running for president or running for anything else. They were arrested because they were receiving and accepting money from the United States to influence the Venezuelan elections, which in the United States they have accused Russia of doing. And it seems that it's only bad when it happens to the United States, but not when the United States does it to other countries, which they often do.
Right. Yeah, that never makes it over here. You know, the idea is it's just some dictator just cracking down on the population. That's how it gets sold. Another question that kind of relates to this as well, because it's still a way of painting any regime that the U.S. doesn't support is bad, but this is when they more race specific. So, how are race, specifically Africanness and indigeneity, being used to delegitimize FSLN and Ortega? And are these legitimate concerns being expressed on the ground about the current government, or is the criticism largely externally driven or funded, similar to what you were speaking about with these so-called opposition leaders?
Yeah, so they left the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and moved to Belize, which became the British colony. It was called British Honduras, and then after that independence, it was renamed Belize. So most of the people on the Caribbean coast are indigenous and Africans. This is where I and 7 other people went to do poll watching. And the Caribbean coast gave the Sandinista government a higher voting percentage than the rest of the country. I think something like 84% of the people in Bluefield and in Pearl Lagoon voted for the Sandinista compared to the rest of the country, where the voting percentage, although a majority, was less. And the people there expressed that they have autonomy. They have autonomy in the sense that those communities on the Caribbean coast control their territories, their asset. And for the Black people on the Caribbean coast, they see that as Black power. They not only control it, but now they have the resources of the government at their disposal. And so since 2007, they have built 2 universities on the Caribbean coast. Before that, if you wanted to go to a university, you had to go to Managua. They have built paved roads between Bluefield and Managua, which before they didn't have. They're building roads between Bluefield and Pearl Lagoon, which currently they don't have. If you need to go to Pearl Lagoon, you have to get on a boat. So they saw these things as progress in other aspects. And for that reason, they voted for the Sandinistas. I haven't really seen too much where they have brought the question of race into play like they have done in both Venezuela and Cuba. But the relationship between the African communities and the Native Americans, the indigenous communities, are very, very good. And their support for the Sandinista is at a all-time high. This is not to say that there's no opposition at all. I'm saying that that opposition, where it exists, is the minority.
I think that's an important thing to point out. And because I think we saw similar things even in the early years of Chavez, when one of the reasons why they gained such popular support early on had to do with real material improvements to conditions of life, right? And so, it might seem mundane to have these conversations about paving roads between two places, but what people often don't realize is that a lot of those people who live in those communities might work in other communities or have to go into these other communities daily for food or other kinds of resources. And so the paving of roads cuts down significantly on the amount of time that they spend moving. So these are very sort of real kind of material everyday concerns that then push people to vote for people who are making their lives better, right? In a very real kind of way.
Of course.
Yeah. So, for our final question, I wanted to ask about the US has recently passed this Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to Conditions for Electoral Reform Act, which authorizes another regime of sanctions for corruption, for quote unquote corruption and human rights abuses in Nicaragua. What was the motivation for this act, for the passing of this act, and what will be some of the economic and political impacts for ordinary people? And lastly, how does this compare to what the US is doing in places like Cuba and Venezuela?
It's the same. The motivation is regime change, and they're actually passing these laws as a precursor to create more sanctions. But for the United States to be such a great liar, perpetuator of lies, because this country currently is in a struggle to ensure that it's harder for Black people and people of color and indigenous people to vote. And here they are going outside of the US talking about somebody else stopping people from voting. And again, I don't think that this is true. From what we saw, it definitely was not true. And not only did we see it here, we saw it in Venezuela, where in December, there was a National Assembly vote, which the Venezuelan won. The party in Venezuela, the Venezuelan Socialist Party won. We are on our way to Venezuela in one day, and we will again observe the election. And I'm sure that the party in Venezuela will win again, because people are fleeing Venezuela because of economic sanctions, because life is so hard. The materials you need to live, food, medicine, etc., they cannot get because of the US blockade on Venezuela. But the US tells you that they're fleeing Venezuela because of suppression and because the opposition doesn't have a right. The US went as far as to create the president of Venezuela. Juan Guaido was elected by himself. And then immediately after he was elected by himself, he was recognized by the Trump administration. So there's no illusion about what the US, when they talk about democracy, means, because is it democracy for everybody else, but not for the US? It's regime change. And not only do we have to fight against this regime change, I tell you, we also have to fight against the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is the most backward tool of the United States and South and Central America. This tool is a mouthpiece that repeats verbatim, uncritically, every statement that the United States make.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's an important and critical place to end. And maybe after you have also observed the elections in Venezuela, we will have you back to talk about what you have witnessed there. But we want to say thank you for sharing with us what you have witnessed and learned. And we know that our audience will appreciate this special report from on the ground. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you, my brother.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care. Be safe.
All right.
So, we are with what we on, not what I'm on, but what they're on. I got dragged into this segment like most of the show.
Hi.
so, 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 um, so y'all are hosting a seminar, part of Insight. It is not a conference because for the people who will confuse these things like I will, it's just a seminar. It's called Revolutionary Pan-Africanism Against Racial Capitalism, Lessons for Our Present Moment. So can y'all talk about what this is and how it came to be?
Yeah, so Insight has these series of seminars that they host. It's kind of like a nonprofit organization. And so basically they reached out and was like, you want to do this shit? And I was like, only if Layla does it with me. So then I hit up Layla, I forwarded her the email, said, you want to do this? We could do like maybe revolutionary Pan-Africanism or something. And she said, I'm down. And so that's effectively how it came about. Like we checked out the website to see the different types of seminars that have been offered in the past to get a sense of like what exactly we wanted to do. And then that's really just kind of, that's it.
Yep. I mean, you know, this is the story of my life these days. CBS does stuff because every time I get an invitation to do something, and I'm like, CBS, we have something to do with this. She's like, yeah, probably. Most and like 99% of the time, yes. So usually apparently she's my agent. So yes.
Agent.
Multi-potentialite.
So how did you plan it, like conceptually?
So for me, when I started thinking about this, I was actually thinking about what kinds of things I actually wanted to reread. And so I think when we were thinking about so the structure, first we were just kind of like, it's 3 hours, like what we're gonna do with 3 hours. And apparently like the way the structure of the seminars works is that you can recommend some readings ahead of time and maybe think about some things that you could read as a part of the seminar and, you know, facilitate discussion. One of the things that CBS and I talked about was that and maybe this is an erroneous assumption, but our assumption was that a lot of people would be coming not necessarily having had access to a lot of what the actual revolutionary Pan-Africanism readings are. Because I think for us, some of the initial questions that we asked were even what do people understand Pan-Africanism to be? And for me, this has been something that I've really been contemplating for a long time in my own research, because there are, I think, different ways people understand Pan-Africanism. Like on the one hand, there is this sort of like Pan-Africanism as just a sort of kind of geographical descriptive kind of category, right? So like Pan-Africa in terms of the continent. I think there are some ways that Pan-Africanism has gotten sort of misused, and is often associated with what people understand to be the sort of Hotep crowd, or even the way
like Black cosmopolitanism. Oh,
exactly. Well, yes. So Black cosmopolitanism, and even some of the, I think, misunderstandings that people who consider themselves to be anti-Pan-Africanism have, right? So part of that was just that, like, how do we come to a seminar and allow people to have a shared understanding, at least of where we're coming from, and then begin to have a conversation. And so we chose a number of readings. Let's see. So Hakeem Adi has like a sort of book, which is like a history of, is an introduction or a history of Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, it's Pan-Africanism, a history. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, history. And I think we chose the introduction and maybe one other chapter from that. Sekou Touré's speech to the Six Pack. We chose another tricontinental speech from Cabral. We decided to choose some axioms from Kwame Nkrumah. And so one of the things we also talked about was just like, who are essential people that we have to at least introduce people to, right? So even if we don't give people everything to read, there are some names and some, you know, thinkers that we needed to at least expose the crowd to. So, I mean, I think that's how we got started. I don't know if you want to add anything, CBS.
Yeah, we tried to attend to gender. So, but most of the writings by women, like, so we have both Layla's piece and my piece on racial capitalism. And then we have Onye's piece defining revolutionary Pan-Africanism, because it's just in terms of foundational readings, it could just be very difficult to find stuff by women. And then the other thing, so basically the way that the title came about, or is that, so Rosa Luxemburg has like this saying that I think she drew from Engels or somebody, that's where it's like socialism or barbarism. And so we were saying, well, Pan-African understanding of this is like revolutionary Pan-Africanism or racial capitalism, like those are options. And so we also, so that's why we had some readings on racial capitalism. Sort of what does that mean? How do we understand it? And how is revolutionary Pan-Africanism a way to sort of combat that? Or does it represent a intellectual, but also a material struggle against racial capitalism? And so in terms of format, we just wanted to do a combination. Oh, we also have some sort of clips from Kwame Ture, because we wanted to have it sort of multimedia. We really try to pare down the reading because, you know, we academics and it's just, you know, it's the tyranny of the reading. And so we wanted to have a combination of sort of primary and secondary sources, some multimedia, and then in terms of the structure, have some group conversations, small group conversations mixed in with us, kind of giving short lectures or short sort of definitions of things so that it's more interactive and it's not just us running our mouth for 3 hours, which nobody wants that.
Say, on the question of gender too, so we didn't assign this, but CBS and I were talking about this. A little small pamphlet by Abioma Ezekwe, who works for Pan-African Newswire Press. This little small pamphlet, I don't know if you all can see it. The title of it is Pan-Africanism, Gender Emancipation and the Meaning of Socialist Development. Because I think one of the other things that I often see as a critique of Pan-Africanism is its male dominatedness or whatever. And I think one of the reasons for that is often that a number of the women who were engaged in the type of work weren't necessarily writing. So in terms of what we have access to, if you're not in the archives, if you're not looking at newspapers, you don't actually see a lot of the work that a lot of the women were doing because they didn't necessarily write 12 books like Nkrumah, right? So I think that is often, I think, what happens with a lot of the women. Although even in this text, we get exposed to, what's her last name is Dankwa. There's a couple of Ghanaian women who were journalists and other types of women who were working, who worked to organize a sort of, I forget what the name of the conference was at one moment. It was like an all African women's conference in 1960 in relationship to the sort of growing Pan-Africanist project. So, I mean, I think we're trying to attack it from a lot of different angles.
Mm-hmm. And then, you know, and so as not to conflate gender and women, we also have reading. So that in the ID book, there's a chapter about women. And then also Ture talks about the role of women. Cabral talks about the role of women. So it's also like how people who are in armed struggle are also conceptualizing the role of women, because this is as important for men to be thinking about this shit as women. And of course, there's also the nature of how they're asserting or thinking about masculinity as an anti-colonial, as one aspect of anti-colonialism. So we're trying to hold all of that as we're thinking about and assigning readings.
Right, and these the writers you're speaking about particularly come out of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, right? Like you're not dealing with just any strand of Pan-Africanism.
No,
exactly.
I mean, yeah.
Right.
Period.
You talked about how you set it up like you know, socialism versus barbarism. So revolutionary Pan-Africanism, I mean, y'all spoke about it a little bit, but I guess I'm just more curious. How is that distinguishable from some of these other strands of Pan-Africanism that get misread or just get kind of framed as being the idea, like you were talking about, like a Hotep or Afrocentricity or anything like that?
No, I was just gonna say, well, Layla is gonna give the actual definition of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, but the key difference is socialism. Okay, that's it. That is objectively what the difference is. So Layla, as part of the AAPRP GC, can run the definition off the top of the dome. So
the way that I have always understood it, and this is what my understanding of revolutionary Pan-Africanism is that it's not an ideology. Is that it is actually a political objective. It is the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, right? And so scientific socialism, as opposed to utopian socialism, right? A way in which we understand socialism in a way that we can actually truly implement it, right? But again, that it is not necessarily, I mean, it is related. So like socialism is the ideology, right? Pan-Africanism is not. It is actually a political objective. And so if we are talking about or calling ourselves Pan-Africanists, but then we don't actually concern ourselves with what's happening on the continent of Africa, that's a faulty association with Pan-Africanism in my understanding, right? And so, because I think, and it's interesting because I think it has been, even the All African People's Revolutionary Party, right, it has had a longer sort of standing history among diasporic peoples than it has on the continent, like the party itself, than the life. And even Kwame Nkrumah and Kwame Ture had differences over where the sort of emphasis should be put, right? But the important thing for me is that even, and this I think this happens even in sort of Black studies, is that we have created these kind of false binaries between sort of African studies and Africana studies, or Black African diaspora studies, and we do it in a way that then happens to the sort of detriment or neglect of an actual true political understanding and a treatment of actually the continent of Africa as a present thing, right? So I think a lot of times in Black studies, we often treat Africa as this sort of historical, and that is actually the mistake that I think a lot of hoteps make, is that it treats Africa as this place that they only have a relationship to in the past. Right, that is, we have this sort of historical past relationship with it, as opposed to Africa being a place that exists in the present, where political struggles are ongoing, and that we also need to understand ourselves in relationship to. And one of those things has to do with and this is interesting, right? This understanding of a linked fate, right? If we as people of African descent, of African people, will continue to suffer in the diaspora as long as we are not concerned with what the current political state of Africa is, right? So that if we understand our ability to be free and fully realized subjects in the world as linked to what's happening on the continent, then we can't actually only treat Africa as this sort of primordial or historical past. It is something that we must have a present relationship to.
And so you said like socialism is the ideology. I don't think so. I think socialism is also the objective too. Marxism might be the ideology, but also Marxism is a science of history. So I don't actually know what the ideology would be. Or I think I think Marxism is both ideology and the science of history. I think Pan-Africanism is both the sort of horizon, the outcome, and the ideology, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the only sort of intervention I would make.
No disagreement.
Y'all should discuss that in the seminar. That little enclave that you brought up. Y'all should delve in on that. So how does this relate to your work, both of you? Like, how does this seminar relate to your work?
I mean, it's the essence of what I do. For me, even so, this week's episode is actually our sort of Latin America centered episode. We talk a lot about Venezuela and Nicaragua, but one of the reasons why, for me, I even became interested in a place like Venezuela, for me, like in the academy, like people like to consider themselves specialists of places. I could never call myself an expert on Venezuela. And the reason why I couldn't is because I spent a particular limited amount of time in certain places, right? For me, it was never even about Venezuela. It's not even about Cuba in and of itself. It's about a place where people, and people of African descent in particular, are actively struggling towards socialism. That is the reason why I chose to study Venezuela at that moment, right? And so for me, I early on started to read the sort of Bolivarian project, the Pan-American project, as it related to the Pan-Africanist project, right? Trying to create a United States of Africa in the same way that across the Bolivarian project is about a particular kind of unitedness in Latin America, but in particular, this sort of shift away from some of the mistakes the Cuban Revolution made by ignoring issues and questions of race. What I saw in the case of Venezuela was an attempt to sort of, from early on, rectify that, right? To actually treat people of African descent as central protagonists, right, in this struggle for socialism. And so for me, it is about reading a particular kind of historical configuration of Pan-Africanism onto this contemporary moment of building sort of Bolivarian revolution, and or what people call the pink tide, or sort of left activism in Latin America and in the US. So for me, this question of like Pan-Africanism as the answer to our struggles as people of African descent, I mean, this undergirds all of the research that I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's similar to me. I think on the one hand, yes, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, which is why I identify as a Rodneyist. So a lot of my work is centered on the United States, but because it's also U.S. imperialism and capitalism is necessarily global, and I have a particular focus of the impact of those processes on Black African people. But the racial capitalism aspect is like my bag, as y'all know, like it's sort of the essence of what I do. And not wading into the debates of like, well, if it's racial capitalism, what about gender and all that other bullshit? It's more so that capitalism has a racialized effect, period, that is inscribed in the world system itself. And so thinking about revolutionary Pan-Africanism and racial capitalism together also helps us like guard against the culturalism that can pervade Pan-Africanism, where it's only like cultural connection and, the metaphysical. So a more sort of Afrocentric approach in terms of like the sort of field of Afrocentrism. And culture is absolutely important, though, like culture and heritage and cosmology is absolutely important. But again, similar to what Layla was saying, the sort of materiality, the material and political realities that are ongoing can sort of fall by the wayside. And so thinking about revolutionary Pan-Africanism as a sort of struggle against racial capitalism is something that really animates my own work, and that I think racial capitalism is not just academic. And I think that there's a way that one can use, thinking about how, again, and the other part of my work is that thinking about how people are talking about racial capitalism without calling it that. So the South Africans actually called it out as racial capitalism in like the 1970s and 1980s. But then when people are talking about super exploitation, the way that they defined imperialism and thought about the conjunctures of imperialism, war, and enslavement and super exploitation, to me is what then got named racial capitalism. So also bringing in people who are theorizing, but also building politics and praxis out of a particular understanding of racial capitalism without calling it that is really important.
Yeah, and I think you said in your piece, I just wanted to grab this quote. In your racial capitalism piece, you said, CBS, you said, finally, I agree with Alexander that the resolution of racial capitalism is anti-racist socialism, not a cultural, metaphysical, Black radical tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't say anti-racist anymore. I would say probably Black liberation, Pan-African socialism shit. Because anti-racism, I'm just like,
right,
y'all can have that.
But you see right there, that's growth, right? That's what we all have to be thinking about, the ways that our positions shift on things. Back to our shoot the shit.
Fall back.
Yeah, that line always stuck out to me though, because I think and based on what y'all said, just like calling it socialism like explicitly and not like wading in this kind of, like you said, metaphysical like vibes land of Pan-Africanism, that I think turns a lot of people off that aren't really into that type of thing. So I mean, I think you kind of answered it, but if y'all like to say explicitly like what you hope to achieve with this seminar.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm proselytizing.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get that money, honey. I'm just playing.
No, I think this is something that even when I was when I was in graduate school, I distinctly remember being at it was an African American studies, what was it, like a round table or some shit, and fucking Shill and Bembe talking about Pan-Africanism being passe, right? And we already whatever. And so one of the things that I have sort of, I think, been working towards on my own, working through this, and even through this seminar, is to think about the continued relevance of Pan-Africanism for our own liberatory struggles. And I think in order for us to understand the continued relevance, we have to continue to engage with it. And so for me, when I say I'm proselytizing, it's about continuing to expose people to engage in these types of art and engage in the work that those people who understood themselves as revolutionary Pan-Africanists produce, but also to continue to push the work forward, right? Like because if we don't actually engage with the work, we can't actually understand where some things, some things actually might be outdated, what types of things need to be up, what types of things need to be revisited, what types of things need to be rethought for our present moment. And so for me, that's what I hope to get to achieve, not just through the seminar, but through all of my work.
Mm-hmm. And then just, relatedly and similarly, like that, revolutionary Pan-Africanism is not fuddy-duddy. It's not a thing of the past. Diaspora, I got my critique of diaspora, but like that has not replaced Pan-Africanism, both as an objective and as a form of praxis. And to Layla's point, that I think is an excellent one, we have to move it forward. And so that's why we try to include contemporary and historical readings and also our own works, not for sort of self-aggrandizement, but our work and Onye's work to show that we're still doing this shit. We're still engaging, and we're not young, but we're young-ish. We cool, like we out here.
No, what you're talking about.
Cute. We out here and we're still actively not only using these frameworks, but attempting to put them into practice. And so I think that that's definitely a sort of objective and a goal for this seminar.
Yep.
So
be there.
Or BL7.
I was going to say that and I was like, nope, I'm not going to do it.
So Two Black will drop the link, yes, in the show notes to register. So you will have to do it right after you watch this episode, because it is the very next day. It is November 20th at 11. It is November 20th at 10 a.m. Eastern. Hope to see y'all there.
Yep.
Okay, y'all. What I want to rant about this week is the tyranny of white tears. And of course, here I'm thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse and his actual non-tears, but his ugly cry that he did on the stand to garner sympathy from the jury. And usually we associate toxic, dangerous white tears with white women. And I think that they have their fair share. Like, for example, there was that whole TikTok wave where they would start bawling on cue and then stop to show that they can sort of harness those tears to get whatever effect that they want. But even if we think about like Brett Kavanaugh, for example, when he had his little temper tantrum during his confirmation hearing, like white tears are so dangerous. And they're so dangerous because they are often used in ways to cover up or to rationalize or legitimate violence against racialized and oppressed people. And so I really just wish, like, okay, if white folks are gonna be violent and steal shit and punish and oppress people, I just really wish they would just say it with their whole chest. Like, don't cry, don't try to get out of it. Like, don't have your little temper tantrum, snot and boogers and shit. Like, just own it, because the very least you can do is really be firmly rooted in your oppression, as opposed to, trying to then garner sympathy for it. That's a nefarious thing, is that the tyranny of white tears is the attempt to garner sympathy and garner understanding for extraordinary violence. And that just seems particularly nefarious. And so, listen, take them white tears, bottle them up, sell them on eBay, sell them on Amazon, but save it, because it's dangerous. And all that it does is reify the oppression and the domination of people for whom the system is already stacked against. So tired of them, don't want to see them, don't want to see the red face and we tired of that. Take that somewhere. Take that somewhere and go profit off of it like you do everything else.
All right, y'all. So we have some exciting news. In addition to being on YouTube as a platform, our podcast will now be available on Spotify, and it will soon be available on Apple Podcasts. So if you decide one day that you want to ride in your car and listen to this without using your data, you should be able to do that very soon.
Yay! All right, y'all. And that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. So thanks for tuning in.
I'm Dr. Layla Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. And thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. And we are signing off.
Peace.